In his time, Ivan the Terrible suited Queen Elizabeth. Now let's imagine that an ambassador, British ambassador in Moscow at that time, got a directive from London according to which he comes to Ivan the Terrible and explains the meaning of the Queen's answer. And the meaning is I conflict with my people very often because of the heritage land, etc. And the case is then taken to court, and it's very difficult for me to win the case in court. And I have to admit that sometimes I have to send my favorites to court to bribe the judges to win an essential case. So, this is factually what the Queen did. In our country, we have the rule of the law, and I respect highly the laws of the ruling, the rights, excuse me, of the ruling coalition. That is what she said. And in your country, you do what you want at will. And being so different, how can we unite our fates when there is the rule of the law in your country too, when you respect the freedom and the rights of your boyars or your nobility, then there'll be some ground for negotiations, but it is not realistic now. I mentioned the times of Ivan the Terrible because in scholastic academic papers of mid-90s, they seriously discussed, experts in political and economic sciences started discussing the similarity of the political and economic regime that formed in Russia by that time with the regime I referred to of Ivan the Terrible, when there were absolutely no human rights and no respect to them. And at those times it would be funny to discuss any rule of the law. This is a historic view, but we need to do that to realize how it all could happen. I have very little time, so I want to refer to three basic reasons of the country being plunged into this situation. First, the genetics of the present regime. Second, the delivery or the birth process. And third are gifts of gods of the fate. When I speak about the genetics factor, I mean the ability of the core of the present ruling coalition, which is the KGB type core, and has all the specific peculiarities of their view of the world. This is a very simple, vertically organized world, absolutely different from what modern world is structured on. Their views of human rights are also quite specific. They think that human rights are a fake or a myth, specially invented by the West to have a reason to intervene into our domestic events. They say that human rights are exterritorial. It was stated again in the late 90s. And they say that those myths were invented especially to comply with the imperialist policy. And they say and think the same about human rights and all the rest. Now, the birth process, that is the birth trauma of the regime, the elections of 1999 or 2000, after which they and many others too realized that any elections could be won if you have control over the money, resources, and mass media. Even such as we are, they say, can win elections. So what should be done? Three things: control over money, control over mass media, and control over political competition. The start of the millennium was characterized by the first suppression acts, suppression of rights and freedoms performed by the regime. And third, the gifts of the fate, the sudden and happy appearance of the gigantic hydrocarbon revenues, rent, which added up to the genetic factor and finally shifted the vision of what reality was like. The goals and practices of the regime were transformed too, and by the year 2004, everything changed dramatically. Initially, there were attempts to build capitalism. In the year 2000, the motto was, "We know what to do, just don't stand in our way." By 2003, it became clear that bureaucracy as an instrument of modernization didn't really work, and they shifted to building up capitalism on crony basis. At the same time, corruption started spiraling, theft and came into, and this also raised fears to lose power. Great efforts were targeted at preserving the status quo, which means suppression of any autonomous action or effort in any uncontrolled sphere. By the end of 2004, practically all that could be suppressed was suppressed. The only thing that stayed and that was rather incomprehensible was the society. And the first attack on the human rights activists was made in 2003 when they were... No, that was early 2005 after the Orange Revolution. Orange Revolution aggravated all those complexes, surely, and aggravated the feeling of anxiety around this zone they couldn't comprehend, the zone named society. So that attack failed, and there was a still period for a certain time. But if we look back into history, we'll see a number of examples like that, some small symbolic attempt that later on can either be forgotten and be wiped out, or may get impetus and be realized, and we see an example of that in the campaign of against foreign agents. And there are numerous examples like that. And we cannot say that our authorities do not recognize human rights. They do recognize human rights, not only in rhetorics, but in practice too. But there are three major limitations. First, these are the rights from a certain list. Not all rights, but just rights from a certain list that is authorized by the authority, compiled by the authority, and does not comply with the Constitution at all. Second, only under total control on the part of the authorities, and only in respect of those who are allowed to have their rights protected, because there are some people who speak of some other rights beyond this list, and these surely are foreign agents. They do it because they are paid to do it by foreign countries, and they want to undermine the state. And third, everything may be done within the list, but in a degree in which it does not contradict our own rights, which means the rights of the ruling coalition and every representative of this ruling coalition taken separately. If there's no contradiction like that, then it's quite admissible. Another essential point, the human rights activity may be subdivided into two aspects. One is protection of every single harmed or hurted person. And a second is protecting and safeguarding the common rules of the game. The rules of the game should be such as to ensure that fewer and fewer unhappy and hurt citizens whom we'll have to protect individually would exist. The dynamics of the process is that activity in the second front, that is protecting the principles of the rules of the game, is practically nullified. But what is allowed is protection of individuals, some personalities which find themselves in an unhappy plight. I do not say that this is right or that is wrong. Both things happen, and each of us chooses what to defend more actively or where to be more actively involved in. And finally, we are gradually coming out of the lengthy post-revolutionary period, which is characterized by the people being tired of the revolution, of the policy, and people are half sleeping. Whom we see here in this hall are on the opposite, the vigilant ones, the non-sleepy ones, but many are sleepy, and then protection of human rights is a burden on the shoulders of the authority, because people at large are not doing that. They do not feel like doing that. We know what our authorities did with this protection of human rights, and they went very far on that way, and just imagining that they would be protecting human rights is difficult.
Let me give you an example. Any human rights activist will say, we don't need your advice, just make sure the courts will function properly and the rest we'll do ourselves. But can you imagine what normal justice means in today's condition? Can you imagine the fate of the ruling coalition if our judicial system were proper? So this is unrealistic. Now the question arises whether we can do something, and I will say yes, we can and we must do things, and I will rely on Immanuel Kant, an authority for me. I list him among the top three cleverest people of all time. So he wrote, all kind of reform should begin from reform in one's mind. And we still believe that it's enough to adopt a new law and life will change for the better. This is a sheer lie. If people's brains are not changed, if informal relations and practices do not change, then the best laws are at best skidding and useless, or in the worst case, work for the worse. And I may be asked, how can we change things if they have all the money and they rule all the brains? Now the answer is change those brains. We're all children of the late 2011, and those who were not asleep then, we all call ourselves a creative class. Okay. What the dick, are you a creative class? What kind of creative class are you if you keep saying we have little money and don't have the three main TV channels? That's the authorities' style of thinking, that they can rule everybody if they have the money and control the media. But if we are a creative class, then we must find ways to reach out to people's minds and souls with what we consider as correct. We should do it in a talented and interesting way, using all the channels that today's civilization can offer. And if we are not doing that, it is not a problem of the absence of money or the three TV channels. It's our own problem, so we should start from ourselves. Thank you.